Practice Network webinar and Nonprofit Insights webinar. We are so excited to have you all here. We have such a great group and a really impressive lineup of speakers. Before we get started and jump in, just some logistics. So, if you have a question during the session, please enter it into the chat box at the bottom right of your screen. Or you can also submit questions for the speakers or just generally join the conversation and provide feedback on Twitter using the hashtag VMBPN. And we are actually going to save all the questions for the end and pose them to the speakers then, because we have so much awesome material to get through. Finally, don't worry about taking furious notes or getting down every single word that's said, because we are recording this webinar and we are going to post the full recording on YouTube afterwards and the slide deck on SlideShare. And we're going to send it all out to you in an email. You don't have to do anything. So just sit back and enjoy the ride. It's going to be really fun. So I believe that's it. And without further ado, I am going to hand things over to Greg Baldwin, the president of Volunteer Match.
Hi, thanks, Shari, and welcome to this exciting webinar, Challenging the Status Quo, Rethinking the Value of Volunteers. I am joined today by some of my favorite leaders in the field of volunteering, you've probably, the only reason you're here is probably because you saw all of their names together in one place. We have Karen Baker, who is with us from the great state of California. We have Bobbi Silten, who is the president of the GAP Foundation. And we also have Amy Smith, who is a longtime friend and colleague and is currently the director of strategy at the Action Networks at Points of Light. It is a pleasure to be joined by these terrific leaders and to talk a little bit about what's wrong with volunteering. And some of the things that the status quo around volunteering, some of the kind of the myths and misconceptions and challenges and opportunities that we all face as kind of an ecosystem of folks interested in improving the effectiveness of volunteering. We, again, Shari said, we'll be taking some questions as we unfold, but I want to start this presentation just by giving you a quick overview of what we're going to do today. For those of you who don't know, all of us have been a part of the Reimagining Service Council for the last couple of years, really since I think 2009. A group of folks, a cross-sector group of folks from the foundation world, the nonprofit world, the corporate world, really came together to challenge ourselves to talk about what keeps volunteering from being a more strategic and effective tool in the nonprofit space. Reimagining Service became a forum for having those conversations. So we're going to do a quick overview of what Reimagining Service was all about, and then an overview of some really fascinating research on nonprofit organizations and the relationship between volunteering and volunteer management and the health and success of nonprofit organizations. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how that research has unfolded as an exciting program at the Points of Light, the Service Enterprise Initiative, where we've taken all of that research and put it into practice to help organizations expand their strategic use of volunteers and really change culturally how they think about the value, the effectiveness, and resource of volunteers in their organization. Then we'll do some Q&A and we'll do a quick closing. We're going to try to stay on track here today. So to get started, I would like to introduce you all to my very good friend, Karen Baker, from California Volunteers, the Chief Service Officer of the California Volunteers, who is going to walk us through kind of a brief little background on reimagining service and some of the principles that kept us all on track over the last 3 or 4 years. So Karen, if you can hear me, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Greg, and big thanks to Volunteer Match for bringing everybody together. Hello to everyone. Also really want to throw out a big thank you to Bobbi Silten, the great leader who was the initial individual who had this in mind, and I think has a great sense to operate in a collaborative with a council who saw these same challenges and created Reimagining Service really right after the 2009 National Conference on Volunteering in Service, and really in response to the Kennedy Serve America Act, where we really realized we need to work much more collaboratively together to really support the development of models and resources and research that help make the case for volunteer engagement. And that's what, this is the only slide I'll read, I promise, which is what Reimagining Service really is, which is this national multi-sector coalition dedicated to increasing social impact through effective volunteer engagement. We then set about really trying to get a very wide and diverse group of people together to really agree on some operating principles. What do we all know to be true? And so this is really our framework for our approach to really encourage organizations to effectively leverage volunteer resources to maximize social impact. And the very first principle has to do with the volunteer ecosystem, which I think this gets the prize for the coolest slide. I love that picture. We're really very interdependent, as we all know, when it comes to this work. We know we can increase the impact of volunteerism by working to improve the system across all sectors, which means we have to have the nonprofit, private, faith-based, education, government sector all at the table working together and participating. We know that we all have this important role to play in achieving better outcomes for our communities, and that no one sector can really do it alone, not one piece of that pie. Which takes us to principle 2, which is what we really also recognize is that volunteering can't be this really nice activity, but it has to be a truly core strategic function. And by making it a core strategic function, we believe that volunteers can fundamentally increase our ability to achieve objectives and advance the mission of the organizations. We also believe that if you do that well, you can serve more people in your community and even change the core economics, if you will, of an organization, which can allow you to scale more quickly and in a very cost-effective way. Yet too often, as we all know, volunteers are not engaged in strategic ways that add value to the organization. In addition, this is not I think organizations that think creatively about effectively engaging their volunteers are able to accomplish more and to do so in a more cost-effective manner if they can figure this out. This is not thinking about volunteering as a program that can be easily cut or ignored, but really truly as this core function of an organization. It's just as important as the development department, as I often say. I mean, you can be very busy raising money to add a certain capability to your organization, or you can secure that in a volunteer. And either way, it's going to have the same value to the organization if, you know, managed well and right. Let me turn to the third principle, which really is about the focus of volunteer engagement on true community needs. Rather than really responding to the supply of volunteers, and we've all been slammed as organizations with well-intentioned people picking up the phone saying, hey, I want to make a difference. It's really important that we seek out volunteers that have the core skills that we really need to address our core priorities. You know, what's the real talent and abilities and knowledge that you need to attract to your organization to make the big change that needs to happen? We too often let this supply dictate how we engage volunteers. Instead, these community needs really should come first and really inform what talent we kind of go after. The fourth principle is really focused on the investment that needs to be made. Organizations that make volunteers central to their work and manage them well are able to generate as much as 3 to 6 times the community value from volunteers as the cost to manage them. And that's a really important ratio to keep in mind, especially as you kind of sell this value internally in the organization to the board and to the larger community. This is just a very smart investment. It requires both upfront and ongoing, financial resources, and we need funders who really believe that funding volunteer engagement helps organizations achieve their broader social missions, to raise their voices so that the funding community can learn from their stories. So once again, the 4 principles have to do with the volunteer ecosystem, making it core, the true community needs, and that we obviously need to invest. And if these principles resonate with you, we really encourage your organization to sign on in support by visiting the Reimagining Service website, which is www.reimaginingservice.org. And that's just the wrap-up of the principle review.
So Karen, as this was kind of unfolding, give us a little bit of kind of color commentary on what were some of the underlying challenges, the context of the conversation as we were kind of working through these principles. What did the conversation sound like, in 2009 in your mind?
Well, I think what we've all seen is very just different perspectives. The first time you bring together all the sectors to really talk about, everyone could agree on the goal. It was, what are the challenges that kind of stand in the way of having that vision realized? And it kind of spoke to that kind of the complexity of the ecosystem, right? And you have the private sector that has their challenges and their pressures. They might have the head of their CSR or their foundation or volunteer engagement that is saying we have to get 200 of our best and brightest out there in front of a group of veterans for some meaningful morale-building volunteer work. And of course, the vet-serving organization is like, well, actually what I need is an accountant and some marketing assistance. So it's those disconnects.
You sure we don't have something to paint?
Yeah, exactly. And those are the challenges, exactly, that you face. And so it really was pretty important to start with the principal conversation so that we could all see, do we kind of even have agreement on that page?
Right. And just one more follow-up question. What do you think, why do you think so many organizations don't understand the need to invest in order to make the most of a volunteer program? Why?
I can say for myself, having run a homeless organization in Los Angeles, Chrysalis, that when I was given a choice between getting what I thought was more work done, helping more homeless people get jobs, which was the mission of our organization, versus strategizing on how best to use volunteers, one had kind of an immediate return, and the other, the strategy session, which would have certainly helped me serve a lot more folks, was more longer term, and I just was responding to the short-term pressures.
Right.
So to be honest with you, I don't think I was a terribly thoughtful leader in that moment. But, as I kind of matured and realized, wow, what's really needed if I really want to grow my organization's capacity, you just have to be super smart about how you tap volunteers and do it in this really strategic way.
Right. Well, I think you embody the principle of having reimagined service yourself, and I think, honestly, I feel many of the same things that even running Volunteer Match. I think challenging myself and my organization, to think hard about how volunteers fit in as a core strategic function, and not just as an activity of kind of hosting well-meaning guests at the organization, as opposed to really getting them involved with the real work of the organization, is not an easy challenge, and it really requires a lot of work and a lot of thinking, and some resources to make it actually work. Well, I have one more question that came from the field. Somebody wanted just for you to repeat the stats on what was it on, Sherry? On just the volunteering?
The statistic you quoted about investment in principle number 4.
Yeah, let me just...
3 to 6 times, something like that?
Quoted, yes. We really need folks to understand that it's that organizations that make volunteers central to their work and manage them well, both have to be going on, are able to generate as much as 3 to 6 times the community value from volunteers as the cost to manage them.
Right. That's great. That's a great fact. And we also have some, we'll have some additional great facts coming up in this next section here. So I want to check, Bobbi, do we have you out there on the line?
I'm here.
Awesome. So I want to say thank you very much to Karen and pass over the floor to Bobbi Silten, who I am delighted is joining us. And as I mentioned, she's both the president of the GAP Foundation as well as the senior vice president at GAP Inc. And has been the quiet, steady, determined, confident, inspirational leader who has continued to encourage this cross-sector conversation that really, I think, in the 15 years I've been working in the volunteering space, was really the first time I had the opportunity to spend so much time talking with folks at organizations like Points of Light and in government and at national nonprofit organizations, and it's been a real pleasure and extraordinarily insightful. One of the most insightful things we learned along the way was participating and really sponsoring some research work on what was termed at the time positive deviance. Took a look at the space, the nonprofit space, and rather than looking at what's wrong with it, try to focus on what's going right and identify some organizations that are really outperforming the marketplace in general, or outperforming the kind of the space in general with regard to their volunteer engagement. Understanding a little bit about what those organizations look like and what are some of the benefits of really, really effective strategic volunteer engagement. And with that, Bobbi, I want to turn it over to you and have you take it away.
Great, Greg. Thank you so much. And thanks to you and Karen for the, I think, a little bit overly generous compliments there. But I would say that working on reimagining service has definitely been a labor of love, and a labor of love, I think, for a large group of people. And for those of you who are on the webinar today, hopefully we can share some of what has sparked our thinking and hopefully share some practices that might be something that will help increase the overall impact of your organizations. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through a high-level story that has come out of some research that was done that Greg had mentioned. And I would be very remiss if I didn't say 2 things about this. One, I am not a researcher, so I am playing one on this webinar, and we'll be sharing with you insights that were really developed by a gentleman named Pete York, who has been on the Reimagining Service Council and generously donated research that he had been working on as part of the TCC group for several years, and brought to bear some very interesting data for us to all learn from. And let me explain to you a little bit about what it is that we're going to be looking at today. So it's called the Core Capacity Assessment Tool, or affectionately CCAT for short. And what it is, it's a study of thousands of nonprofits across the country of all sizes, of different issues, both local and national. And what's interesting is that the findings we've extracted that relate to volunteer management were asked in the context of broader organizational performance. So this wasn't a specialized study focused on this particular topic. So any potential skewing that might occur if it were a volunteer management only type of research, we think has been neutralized to a great degree, because the study wasn't designed solely for that purpose. But the TCC group, one of the key areas they work on is evaluating and researching nonprofit capacity. And they built this tool, and it's been administered with over 2,000 nonprofits. So what you're seeing is a summation of what the findings were as it relates to volunteer engagement. Also, to this piece of research, instead of having one point of input, meaning that the executive director or CEO was asked, this research was asked amongst a variety of stakeholders, including board members and staff, as well as the leader of the organization. So we're getting more of a 360 view of what that organization's performance is. So again, trying to bring more perspective and hopefully will underscore the validity of the findings. So let's get into it. And Greg mentioned this term positive deviance, and there was a book that came out several years ago by the Heath brothers. They did Made to Stick, and their second book was called Switch. And one of the premises of Switch is that oftentimes as folks working in a space where we're trying to create huge change, we can oftentimes get mired down in all the things that aren't working and frankly get a bit overwhelmed by them and therefore have difficulty moving forward to create the positive change. We felt that in some ways we were getting weighed down by all things that weren't working and decided instead, why don't we focus on the bright spots? Why don't we focus on the positive deviants, those people who are succeeding despite all the challenges? And what we discovered is that there is a group of these positive deviants, and we decided that these positive deviants are going to be called service enterprises. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how we've defined these service enterprises. We see a service enterprise as an organization that fundamentally leverages volunteers as a core strategic function to achieve the social mission of the organization. So it's fundamental and it's strategic that organizations that are service enterprises really think about volunteers beyond, after I fundraise, after I've filled my staff, after I've filled my board, then I think about volunteers. But these organizations kind of flip the pyramid and think about what needs to get done and then what are the best resources to get that work done. So that's the definition. You'll be hearing more about service enterprise, so it's important that you grasp that really they're organizations that fundamentally leverage volunteers and they do it in a strategic way. So let's jump into some of the data. So on this pie chart that you guys are all seeing, this is an aggregate of how all of the nonprofits that were evaluated perform. And this is how they perform in terms of being strong in volunteer management, being satisfactory in volunteer management, and being weak at volunteer management. And they score on a total score of 300. So you could see that if you're 240 or above, you're considered strong. 17% of nonprofits fell into this bucket. However, only 11% of them were considered service enterprises, and the reason why is that it was driven by the number of volunteers that they engaged, and I'll get into a little bit more of that as we get into the subsequent slides. But first, let's go to the next slide, which kind of breaks down. So when we look at the measurements of volunteer engagement, what were volunteer nonprofits saying we are effective at in terms of volunteer management practices? And there are several listed here. The first one is 26% said they are effective at retaining volunteers. 22% said they're effective at recruiting volunteers. 27% said they are effective at supervising volunteers. 8% said they're effective at clarifying roles.
Ooh.
25% said they're effective at developing volunteers. 13% said resourcing volunteers. 6% said balancing skilled and unskilled. And 30% said valuing and appreciating. When you look at the results here, 30% is the highest percentage of organizations that felt that they were effective. So that's the highest score that any of these nonprofits score themselves at. And in addition to that, we see that there are 3 areas that they're really poorly skilled: clarifying roles, resourcing volunteers, and balancing skilled versus non-skilled. So that gives you a little bit of detail into what makes up this positive performance. So let's now switch gears from the data to what are some of the key findings. And I'll go through several key findings that are the big takeaways from all of this data that was crunched. So let's go to the first finding. The first finding is that we find that all organizations' capacities are significantly and markedly stronger for nonprofits who work with 50 or more volunteers and they have strong volunteer management. You heard that from Karen. It's the combination, 50 volunteers and strong volunteer management. And that all of their organizational capacities, meaning how they perform overall in leadership, in management, are all higher because they are effective at managing volunteers and they deploy 50 or more. And only 11% of nonprofits fall into this group. And again, we call these nonprofits service enterprises.
Bobbi, is there something magic about the 50 number?
Yes, and I'm going to get to that I can do it now so that we don't have to go to slide number, finding number 3. But yeah, there is something magic about the 50. And why is 50 a defining number? The reason why 50 is a defining number was fascinating. I remember the initial conversations when we first looked at this data. What happens is when you get to about 50 volunteers, organizations start to formalize their processes and practices. So they have systems. They have more sophisticated tools that they're using because the volunteer number has gotten so large that without these tools and systems in place, that you can't operate a big operation like that. It's that 50 that kind of tips the organization into a different level of performance and different level of performance overall. So the overall organization performs better when you see 50 or more volunteers deployed and that they have good volunteer management practices.
Yeah, I remember when we were discussing this when this research first came out. I remember thinking to myself that you can kind of fake it until you get to about 50, and at 50 volunteers, unless you have resources and the management framework and are defining your positions and you have it all. You have some systems in place, you'll just be overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And then if we go to the next slide, this is an interesting finding as well. The second finding is that, and this is a correlation, it's not causal, but there's a strong correlation with just managing volunteers well, regardless of how many you have in your organization, that we see that if you manage the number of volunteers well and have any number of volunteers, that the organization itself exhibits much stronger leadership and management behavior. So regardless of the number, just the fact that organizations that deploy volunteers have a strong correlation with organizations that are much stronger led and much stronger managed. So again, not causal, but correlated, that well-led, well-managed organizations engage with volunteers. The third finding, we touched on this a little bit about service enterprise, not only lead and manage better, but they are more significantly adaptable and sustainable, and they're also are better positioned to go to scale. And a big part of this is that they've built in systems and processes that allow them to grow. And so building in volunteer management, good volunteer management, is one of the key ingredients that will help your organization go or enable it, build a platform for it to go to scale because it allows it to be more adaptable and more sustainable. Let's go to the next one because I'm just conscious of time here. The fourth key finding.
You're doing great, Bobbi.
The fourth key finding is that to be a service enterprise, you have to have strong and well-developed human resource management practices, and that the service enterprises that emerged as part of this study, they do have well-developed human resources practices, that most service enterprises do have the mindset that this is unpaid human capital or volunteer employees, that they don't view them as less valuable, but they view them as a resource. And they take the time to define the work that needs to be done by the volunteers so that they can recruit more clearly, they can train the volunteers when they come on board, they can provide adequate supervision and resource, really recognize them for the results they produce, and view and promote volunteers to leadership roles and responsibilities. And so it's, it's great people practices, regardless of whether the people are paid or unpaid. If you practice good people practices, it's a better way for you to create greater impact. So what, again, we see with service enterprises is that we see strong and well-developed human resource management practices. So let's go to finding number 5. So this was a fascinating finding, that organizations that engage at least 10 volunteers are as equally as effective as their peers without volunteers. So if you compare an organization that has 10 volunteers, a nonprofit, to a nonprofit that has no volunteers, they are equally as effective, but at half the median budget. So this key finding here really gets to the economic value of volunteers, that when you engage this resource well and you leverage it, that it has an economic impact. And it also, this finding, I think, really raises an interesting point about reframing the idea of fundraising. And when we looked at this, one of the things Pete York, who did this analysis, said, you know, when we look at the data for nonprofits, one of the big ticket items in a P&L of a nonprofit is headcount, paying for staff. And he said if we could think about volunteers as an extension of that, might we think about resource raising versus going to fundraising first, paying for all the things we need to pay for, and then leveraging volunteers to a different mindset of saying, what do we need to get done? What resources might deliver that? And sometimes the resources are paid, and sometimes the resources are volunteers. But let's use both as our resource pool to get our work done, and think about it more as resource raising versus fundraising. So I'm going to get to the last one because I know we have more to talk about on the service enterprise front, and I'm going to go to the last finding, finding number 6. And this was an additional analysis that Pete York conducted, that service enterprises are more cost efficient. And what this chart is showing, the red line shows organizations that are considered not to be service enterprise. So these are nonprofits that don't effectively leverage volunteers and don't use 50 or more volunteers. And this is the dollar per hour of program labor. So it's a proxy of cost per output. And for every hour of output, this is what it costs a nonprofit. So a very small nonprofit, it costs $27.73. And for a large nonprofit, it's $100 and $101.92, compared to organizations of the same size who are service enterprises. So those that leverage volunteers, 50 or more, and do it effectively, that the cost per hour of output is significantly lower. And so this is another finding where it does make sense to make this investment in effective volunteer management, because you could start to see the return. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Greg.
Bobbi, great. And one question for you before we move on to Amy. And I know this has been asked before, but if successful and smart strategic volunteer engagement is so strongly correlated with successful nonprofit organizations, why in the world are only 11% of nonprofits that are taking advantage of this, in your view?
Well, I think this is part of what Reimagining Service is trying to do. I think that a part of this is that nonprofit leaders have a lot of important work that they're doing, and they're really focused on delivering impact against their mission. I think that historically we haven't shared a lot of this insight, and I think that's one of the great things about this webinar is we're sharing new data, new insights about how volunteers can make a big difference. And I think the other thing too, to Karen's point about the principles, is that also we need to better inform the volunteer community who are bringing the volunteers of deliver support and services where they're needed, where an organization truly needs the work to be done. And I think a lot of what I'm excited about this webinar is it's having a conversation with the ecosystem, right? It's having conversation
Right.
with all the players, sharing new insights and knowledge so that we can start to integrate this type of practice more broadly. But, you know, I do think that it is a piece of information, if more widely spread and used, that we can start making a real big difference in how many people we serve and how well we serve them as a community.
Knowledge is power.
That's right.
Bobbi, thank you so very much. Thank you all out there. I'm looking over Shari's shoulder just to see any other questions that are out there. Any key questions that we should tackle before we move on? There's some great conversations out there, but I'm going to let Amy give us a little bit of an orientation to what's actually happening in the field, kind of resources right now for nonprofit organizations that are really interested in strengthening and digging into their volunteering program, changing the way they think about it, and really producing results, going through a process really of learning and transformation. Amy, if you have not yet met her, is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Points of Light. She is smart, energetic, and a very terrific leader at the Points of Light, and has been working on these challenges for more than a decade. And I'm really excited about the work that the Points of Light is doing to extend this research and turn it into something very practical for the nonprofit field. So Amy, if you are out there, please take it away.
Great. Wouldn't you be scared if I said, if there was radio silence? Good morning / afternoon, everyone. I am thrilled to be sharing a little bit of how we're bringing all of the principles that Karen shared and some of the research findings that Bobbi was able to share to life. So first, I just can't go all the way through this without thanking Volunteer Match for hosting this, for all the people on the council and all the work. It's really fun to see this come to life and to be able to share it with such a broad group of people. And then to also just thank Kyra, who's our fearless leader, and making sure we kind of see all this through. So thanks, Greg, for hosting this. I am going to share a little bit about the Service Enterprise Initiative, and this really is about how we're bringing to life and making practical the work of the research and of the findings that Karen and Bobbi were able to share with you. And I want to reinforce one thing that Bobbi mentioned, because it's kind of been my guiding light in being part of the council, and that is, imagine the day where organizations treat their financial resources and their human resources in the same sort of way, with the same kind of care, with the same sort of strategic intent. And that is what Reimagining Service has been focused on, and that really is what plays out in the Service Enterprise Initiative. So it's much more than a volunteer management training. This is really about a change management process and a human capital management strategy for organizations. So we have taken these principles in deep partnership with California Volunteers, and Karen is an absolutely inspired leader that went through the process of helping create the and have the findings resonate with the council and beyond, and said, yeah, but what does it mean on the ground, right? And so this Service Enterprise Initiative was inspired by the work of Reimagining Service and really the brainchild of California Volunteers. We're excited to be a part of that partnership with California Volunteers and with the Corporation for National Community Service, and we're excited to be part of taking these great ideas to scale. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit and give you a little kind of the nuts and bolts of how it works. Really talked about already, you know, that this concept strengthens the capacity of nonprofits to more strategically leverage those volunteers, that human capital management, that change management inside an organization, to strategically use that. Since 2012, we've had about 17 volunteer centers in collaboration with state commissions kind of be part of this pilot program. So we're learning a lot, and as we start to take this from where we are today in about 11 states, we plan to move to about 16 states over the next year in partnership with Hands-On Network affiliates, with state commissions, and other nonprofit partners. If we could go to the next slide. This one's a little bit dense, but gives you kind of the, so how does this thing really work, right? And so in local communities, there are hubs that hold the Service Enterprise Initiative and help nonprofits go through the process of becoming a certified service enterprise. Right now, they are all nonprofit organizations, just to give you a little sense of it, but state government and schools have started to show interest, and so we're figuring out how this program would translate to those sorts of entities. As a hub, you probably would have somewhere between 5 and 7 organizations in a cohort and maybe 15 to 30 people in any one of the trainings. So it just gives you a little sense of the sort of size and scope of any particular cohort. The process in becoming a service enterprise looks like sort of the roadmap on this slide. So the hub, who is kind of helping these nonprofits through the process, does this outreach, gets to nonprofits, helps them understand the principles, and helps them think about whether or not becoming a service enterprise might be right for them. And then there's an application process. And that's really to help create a set of baseline data that helps the hub understand maybe they already are well on their way to being a service enterprise, or maybe they're at a very different place in their process, in their change management process. And so it really gives the hub, and sometimes if there's a funder involved, the information they need to assess readiness for the process. So once that application is filled out and reviewed, the hub selects whether or not that organization has readiness to go ahead and go through the process. And that process is really a 6 to 12 month commitment, and it really requires both executive and senior leadership in the organization to engage in the process. You kind of need buy-in across the organization. The diagnostic is, I think Bobbi went over some of the CCAT test results. The CCAT and some other diagnostic tools that are out there in the world were sort of brought together to create the Service Enterprise Diagnostic that allows us to sort of test for opportunities for growth, opportunities where the organization already has good strengths, and really kind of goes deep on the 8 characteristics of a nonprofit service enterprise, so that they have kind of building the roadmap for what needs to happen inside that organization to become a service enterprise. So once they kind of go through that, the hub sits down with the organization and really kind of goes through that diagnostic with them, helps them start to develop an action plan, build upon their strengths, and figure out which of the challenges they kind of want to address throughout the course of the change management. So they have that meeting, they kind of build that plan together, and then they're launched into this training and coaching component of the overall time together. So there's about 16 hours of training. It's in 4 modules administered over 4 to 6 weeks about. And there's also sort of 10 hours of coaching that the organization can use as they need. Maybe they're getting stuck on something, or maybe they're not getting the engagement of their senior leaders in the way that they need to. And those hubs can play that coaching role and support those leaders through that process. There's also homework throughout the process. So this is, like I said, a pretty significant commitment, but one that will yield all the results that Bobbi outlined in the findings, or at least that's what we think is happening out there. And so once they complete that process and they feel as though they have made adequate progress against goal, they actually call for a site visit. So that organization says, we have readiness, we're ready to go through the site visit process. And so when the hub comes back to do that site visit, they sort of collect documentation that shows that they've made progress against plan. The hub reviews all of that and approves or not, right? Maybe sends them back to tweak or work on a few components that maybe they didn't quite get as far as they think that they need to be successful. And then if they are approved, the hub makes a recommendation for certification to us here at Points of Light. And if that certification is approved, and really we take the recommendation of the hub, of the partner that's been working with the nonprofit, and if approved, then a certification seal is sent out. And that certification is good for 2 years. And then we sort of go back to the diagnostic and just make sure that we're still on track. So I know that was a mouthful, but I think it helps to kind of give you that sense of the nuts and bolts of how does it actually work to become one of these service enterprises and be able to start reaping some of the benefits of what happens when you do become a service enterprise.
Right.
So going to the next slide, a little bit about the benefits, right? You've heard those throughout the time together, but certainly builds greater capacity through that human capital investment to achieve your mission. It also allows you to focus on partnerships in a different kind of way. So increasing your organizational excellence, making sure that your core staff has time to do some of the other strategic work that might be required of them. And it really differentiates your organization. We're focused on developing partnerships at the national level, for example, with GuideStar. We're in conversation with them right now to sort of show your certification on your profile on the GuideStar page. We really hope that companies and funders and partners start to recognize the certification as that sort of good housekeeping seal of an organization that's effectively using all of the resources available to them. I think that's all I have to say on that one. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about our progress to date. You can go to the next slide.
But before you pass on the slide, Amy, I'll just underscore for any corporate partners out there, if you are looking to be the partner of the year to a local nonprofit organization, considering funding this process for your favorite nonprofits, or taking a look at it, I think could be an awesome investment. If you run a nonprofit organization, you're always trying to build better partnerships with corporations, and one of the biggest challenges is often, how do you effectively run a really great volunteer management program? So it can be a wise investment that can really strengthen a relationship and a partnership. So if you're on the corporate side out there, you may want to take a look at sponsoring your favorite local nonprofit organization through this program. All right, Amy, keep going. That was
sure. No, thanks, Greg. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm going to call on all my colleagues here at the end to make sure I didn't miss anything critical. So progress to date. Here's how we're doing. Right. So we have over 70 certified organizations, and we hope to be at 200 by the end of 2014. So we really are focused on the thing, focused on making sure that we are getting this great product and tool out to as many nonprofits as possible, so that we're using volunteers in the most strategic way as possible. We actually thought that maybe the total number of volunteers engaged might go down in this process. You're using them more strategically. You're using them in a different way inside your organization, and we've actually seen quite the opposite. That 60% increases in the total volunteer numbers. That's an increase in the total volunteers participating. The interesting point about that is about 50% of those are skills-based volunteers. And there's a whole other webinar to talk about how do you effectively engage skills-based volunteers and how do you make sure that you're bringing the right skills into your organization. And we do touch on that in the service enterprise training, but that's just an interesting anecdote that's kind of coming out of what we're learning in these first cohorts. We're also working really hard over the next few months to capture more case studies of success. What's working, what isn't, what are we learning from going through this process? And although we don't have specific longitudinal data just yet from our cohort 1, we are seeing promising anecdotal data and excited about the progress that these organizations are able to make in their change management process. So I think that we are doing a set of follow-up surveys really related to some of the grant money we've received to make sure we're showing progress in not only the model, but in the scaling efforts of the model, because it's one thing to sort of do it at a small scale and try it with a handful of organizations. It's quite another to make sure that it resonates and you hold the quality of it over the course of time. And so that's something that I want to make sure that we speak to, and we are testing that, and we are doing follow-up surveys with our first cohorts. We'll be doing second surveys to give us even more data, more specifically and more broadly looking at what are the changes being seen in the organizations, and are those sustaining changes across what they're able to do as it relates to their mission impact. And we think that's an important next step in making sure that not only do we see the benefits of using volunteers more effectively, but that actually has missional impact. And so we'll be surveying that against the service enterprises going forward. So just in sort of wrapping up my section here, and we know we want to have a few minutes time for questions, you certainly can get more information about becoming a service enterprise on the Points of Light website. It's pointsoflight.org/service enterprise initiative with dashes in between. I think that's on that last slide you'll see here. And you can get all the information you need right there. If you are thinking about becoming a hub and you are considering it in the short term, there actually is still time in the current application round. But do hurry. We are closing the applications at the end of the month, and so we'd want to be able to receive anyone's interest or application of interest by August 22nd. So you'll want to reach out to us pretty quickly if you are interested in becoming a service enterprise and or considering becoming a hub. That's it. I'll help fill any questions. And actually, Greg, if I could take 2 minutes of calling on my incredible colleagues from around the call and making sure that I didn't miss anything on this point, most specifically Karen. I know we've been working in partnership and lockstep on all of this, and I would hate to leave any important points behind.
Yeah, just only quick point, and just to note, and you may have noted it and I missed it, is just the important role that University of Texas and Pete York continue to play on the diagnostic tool piece of this,
yeah.
Because I think they're just such critical partners, and the initial 4 volunteer centers in California that really were the backbone of creating the pilot. They were phenomenal.
Yeah, great point. So Karen's referencing back on the process map, which you don't have to go back to on the slides, but when you talk about the diagnostic tool and the service enterprise diagnostic tool that's been developed, that is in partnership with RGK at UT Austin and Pete York. And Bobbi talked a little bit about Pete's work at the TCC group and the CCAT that was developed. But the service enterprise diagnostic is a combination of those two. And I did mention that, but I went kind of quickly over it. And they are playing a critical role in helping us make sure that we maintain the integrity of the purpose and reason why we're doing this, but also that we're learning as much as we can as we go along. So thanks for bringing that up, Karen.
That's great. So a couple of quick questions that have come in from our audience. This one I think is, let's do kind of Bobbi and then Karen. What's the role? What is the role of companies and government in all of this? We've kind of alluded to it, but Bobbi, what do you think the role of companies is in all this?
Well, I think the role that companies can play are several. One, I think just what Amy mentioned, I think you referenced it, be a good partner to nonprofits, support their movement toward being a service enterprise. I also think that corporations should look at their own practices and apply the reimagining service principles to their practices. Are they thinking about the ecosystem? Are companies thinking about volunteering more strategically and fundamentally, not as an add-on of the work that they do? Are they volunteering for the work that's needed? And with partners, are they making that investment, and are they investing in their own volunteer management infrastructure? Right. So I would say, I'm a big advocate of companies living and breathing the principles just as much as we are encouraging our nonprofit partners to do so.
And Karen, how about you from the government side?
Yeah, on the government side, I think there's kind of 2 arenas. One is as investors in this, and thanks to the Volunteer Generation Fund from the Corporation for National Community Service, dollars have been made available so that we can invest in the development of this whole initiative. We're very grateful to the federal government for that, for those dollars, and match dollars that were raised locally. And those dollars provide scholarships so that nonprofits have an opportunity to be sponsored as they go through this process, at least with a set number, which has been phenomenal. So we're an investor in that way. And then secondly, like Bobbi, we too want to be models of this work. I know in California we're starting a new effort. We've already seen how California does, I think, a great job of utilizing volunteers in its park system, in disasters, in a number of arenas where government plays a critical role, but we're starting to look at things like corrections and how we can be more vibrantly engaged with CDCR, California Department of Corrections and Rehab. So those are some new frontiers.
Interesting. Another quick question. Advice for, there's someone out there saying, it's all great, but how do you invest and expand your volunteer program at an organization that is already stretched too thin? What advice do you have for that? How do you break out of the cycle?
And do you want?
Why don't you take it first, Karen? I mean, you've been in that situation.
Oh, I've so been there. I mean, what you have to do, which is the hardest thing to do, is to just stop doing something that you absolutely swear is a priority, and decide to focus on the long game, and realize that if you can get this transformation completed and become a service enterprise, your capacity and ability to really address the needs of your client base are exponentially, met. And so it's just worth saying no to priorities and getting your board of directors on board.
Yeah, and Karen, just to build on that, I would say that one first step would be to sit down with your board chair and to ask your board chair if they would support you in talking to your fundraising committee, because I'm sure all of you have a fundraising chair, to say, can we change the way we think about this and think about this as a resource-raising committee, and can we think about how we more effectively engage volunteers as a part of that? And that dialogue, whether or not you end up forming a fundraising and resource-raising committee or not, I think just engaging your board chair, engaging the people who help you raise resources for your organization into this broader dialogue, share some of this research and insight, and see if they can help support you, or maybe even get a funder who would be willing to help underwrite your first step in moving forward and, like Karen said, getting at the most important issues for your organization.
Yeah, this is Amy. I just want to add, I think that opportunity to have the conversation around shifting the mindset internally, like I said and had to reinforce when I opened, that light bulb going off for me and managing the complete suite of resources inside an organization, I think is such a smart first step that just starts to get the organization thinking and talking about it differently. And instead of saying, this is one more thing, this is how we do more, just kind of changes the conversation a little bit. And I think it's a pretty easy first step just to open a conversation and say, hey, I've been exposed to this really cool information. Can we talk about it a little bit?
So we are nearing our 1 hour, and I want to say thank you again to Bobbi, Karen, and Amy for taking time out of their busy lives to be with us today. I'd like to thank all of you who've taken time out of your schedule to join us today. Thank you for your participation and your questions. A reminder that we'll be sending this to all participants so you have all the links and information and data, and underscoring that if you are interested in the Service Enterprise Initiative at the Points of Light, please follow up with Points of Light, check out the website, and if you're, again, if you're interested in some of the larger research or some of the resources that we mentioned, reimaginingservice.org is a great place to go and take a look. And I want to put in a huge thank you and a quick plug for those of you who are interested in staying involved with this BPN network. We've got some information here. Volunteer Match has a blog. You can follow us on Twitter. And is there another webinar that we want to make sure people know about?
There will be another Nonprofit Insights webinar next month in September. It's not up yet, but if you go to learn.volunteermatch.org and keep on top of that, we'll be sending information. And the Best Practice Network webinar series is taking a break for the month of September because we will be having our annual Client Summit this year in Detroit. We're very excited. But we'll be back in October, so we hope to see you all on the call then.
All right, so thank you again to everyone. It's been a pleasure, and good luck out there in building out your volunteering programs and finding ways to more effectively engage all the goodwill and talent of your local communities. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.